This is the fifth Rory O'Connor podcast, published on the 11th of January 2018. Fire and Fury, an interview with Tim Coles about the latest developments in the North Korean crisis and the United States' strategic long-term interests in East Asia.
North Korea best not make any more threats to the United States. They will be met with fire and fury like the world has never seen. He has been very threatening beyond a normal statement. And as I said, they will be met with fire, fury, and frankly power, the likes of which this world has never seen before.
It's not something that lends itself to an easy solution. We could obviously destroy North Korea with our arsenals, but aside from the humanitarian costs of that, they are right next door to our vital ally, Republic of Korea.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
It is pointless for them to try to develop nuclear weapons because if they use them, it would be the end of their country.
Hi, I'm Rory O'Connor. Today we'll be discussing the latest events in the North Korean crisis and especially the strategic interests of the countries immersed in it, especially the United States and the US's broader involvement in East Asia. I'm talking with Tim Coates, who's the author of Fire and Fury, not that one, whose subtitle is How the US Isolates North Korea, Encircles China and Risks Nuclear War in Asia, published by Clairview Books in December 2017. He is a founder and director of the Plymouth Institute for Peace Research, whose website is pipr.co.uk. In the past 2 years, he's been writing a series of kind of timely books about geopolitical and economic matters, published by Clairview as well, namely Britain's Secret Wars, The Great Brexit Swindle, President Trump Inc., and he's edited Voices for Peace. About his newest book, Fire and Fury, Bruce Cummings, who's a professor at the University of Chicago, who has written a number of well-regarded books about Korea. He said, Coles has written a sharp critique of the fundamentals of American policy towards North Korea and the distortions in our media which typically treat the North Korean threat in a vacuum, devoid of either contemporary American threats or the long history of American nuclear intimidation of the North. So, hi, Tim. How are you doing?
Oh, yeah, good, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
You're very welcome. I think, so I mean, actually, just how does it feel to have to share a book title with the most talked about book of the year, or the week anyway?
It's strange, actually, because some journalists from the mainstream have contacted me, and usually they wouldn't have anything to do with me, but simply by the coincidence of the books being the same title, they're interested to know if I've had any huge upswing in book sales, which I certainly have not. So it's been quite
my next question, but that's disappointing. Yeah. So and your one was yours was first, so you can say that much.
Yes, although actually people have written books with the title Fire and Fury long before me, so I think it's quite a typical title, actually.
Yeah. Well,
it's very much in the mainstream, so and of course he claims to have had a lot of access to the White House, so it's much more topical, and he has much more backing from certain sectors of the media. So, but good for him and his book.
Yep. I still hope you get a few accidental sales, whatever. They'd probably be very, very edifying for them, for whatever person gets it on the doorstep. So I don't know. But it's been even since the book was published last month in December. We're recording on the Tuesday, the 9th of January. There's been a rake of news in the meantime, and so I don't know. There's been the national security strategy came out, which is has been one of the main focuses in North Korea. They're talking about area defense, compelling denuclearization, the ability to defeat missile threats prior to launch. There's been the Telegraph reported on December the 20th about a bloody nose attack being in preparation, with a step-by-step build-up and so on. It's been pretty crazy.
Yeah, these developments are very alarming, not just because if the United States does attack North Korea, the human cost for North Korean civilians will be appalling, and probably South Korean civilians if North Korea retaliates against US interests in the South. But even more alarming, it could escalate the nuclear tensions between the US and China and the US and Russia, and could very well lead to some sort of misunderstanding or even a malfunction of computer equipment. And these sorts of malfunctions have happened quite often in the past. In fact, a few years ago, Chatham House, the Royal Institute for International Affairs, published a report, I think it's called Too Close for Comfort or something like that, which goes through the history of declassified near accidents with nuclear weapons, and it's quite frightening. And in fact, the British Ministry of Defence regularly publishes strategic trends programs in which they talk about what they envisage is going to happen in the next couple of decades. And they are quite clear that possession of nuclear weapons, coupled with very complicated geostrategic interests on all sides, is increasing the risk of accident. So this kind of rhetoric and the implementation of US forces in the region, it's getting extremely worrying. And a lot of experts, like say the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, they're quite aware of that. But unfortunately, you can find very little coverage of how serious this is in the media.
I think so. That's the big picture, and there's also the factor of the U.S. presence in South Korea, and the interest in North Korea is also to do with countering China. And for example, I think his name was Major Spider Marks recently was saying that in September, it was reported in the New Yorker last September, as saying that relations with North Korea are a subset of relations with China. But I think first of all to get into, and we'll come back to that bigger picture in a moment, but to talk narrowly about why this, and as it were, why now especially. There's at least a clue of that, perhaps, in the New York Times report yesterday. However reliable it is, but for H.R. McMaster, who's the Trump's national security advisor, was saying just recently that now, for whatever reason, he believes that North Korea is the greatest immediate threat to the United States. So do we have any clue about, as it were, why this, why now? There's a difference between this and, say, the Iraq. Perhaps there might be a difference, I don't know. I'd be interested in your perspective between the the build-up to the Iraq war, the constant drumbeat as regards Iran, and this, perhaps.
Yeah, it really depends how we consider threats. Certainly North Korea is a threat to US interests in the sense that because North Korea has, or at least claims it has, nuclear weapons, that prevents the United States from doing whatever it wants in the region. And the United States doesn't tolerate that sort of behavior. So with regard to Iraq, the United States certainly, and Britain as well, but it was mostly an American-led invasion in 2003. The United States did not want Saddam Hussein to acquire weapons of mass destruction at a particular time, because that would constrain America's ability to invade the region. And this is why it allows its closest ally, Israel, to have nuclear weapons, so it can act as a kind of US proxy in the region. And if you read strategic planning reports, the ones that are available to the public, they expressed the same concerns about Iran, that if Iran were to develop nuclear weapons, that would prevent the United States from attacking the region at will. So in that sense, North Korea is a threat to US interests because alleged possession of nuclear weapons has a restraining effect on US actions. But in terms of being a literal threat to America's survival, I mean, there's some kind of threat. The supposed intercontinental ballistic missile that supposedly went toward the United States, I mean, that could have ended up injuring Americans, but North Korea's technology is so far behind the US. Apparently, the missile disintegrated on re-entry, so that wasn't much of a threat. And in fact, successive US strategic reports state this, that North Korea's military ability, including its missiles, are far behind the US. So there's quite a gap between what intelligence reports say and what politicians or civil servants within the military or within the White House claim. And it's very interesting to look at the media response. I think it's fair to say that whether you support Trump or not, the media, the mainstream sort of liberal CNN type media, have been very critical of Trump's personality and domestic politics. But as soon as it comes to foreign policy, they just swallow the propaganda. So CNN had an interview recently with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, in which they were talking about the way to constrain North Korea. That was the premise of the discussion. It wasn't how do we constrain the United States from trying to take over the world in its policy called full spectrum dominance. So that was the basis on which they held the discussion. And Tillerson was able to just simply make stuff up and say that the US is committed to peace, and was hardly challenged by the reporter. And the US wants to condition so-called peace talks on North Korea disarming, having denuclearization. And this is, Rex Tillerson said that this is the standard of the other interested parties like China, etc. But China and Russia, as far as I know, haven't preconditioned peace talks on denuclearization. And in fact, the history of peace talks, even between the US and North Korea, which we could get into later, has shown that the US has failed constantly to live up to its negotiations and its obligations.
Yeah, and on the point of like a precondition of denuclearization, it's giving up nuclear, biological, or chemicals weapons. There's no incentive, as it were, to do that in dealing with the United States, because apparently you raise in the book that one of Gaddafi's, Colonel Gaddafi's last comments was, Kim Jong-il must be laughing. He had given up whatever weapons he had in 2006, I think, and wasn't rewarded for his efforts in 2011.
That's correct, and a lot of countries feel that way. So back in the late 90s, India, which has not much chance of being attacked by the United States, I think an Indian defense minister said, if you want to deter an attack from the US, you should get yourself a nuclear weapon. And various strategic reports, like some of the ones I mentioned from the British Ministry of Defence, they're quite clear that as the United States modernizes its nuclear programs, this is simply provoking other countries to do the same. But as far as public understanding of this is concerned, much of this is kept out of the media, the cause and effect and the chronology. So it just seems as if the world is plodding along randomly, and the US is responding to threats from, say, Russia as it builds up its nuclear arsenals and modernizes, or as China does the same, and now from North Korea. All of the context and background is eliminated, and so people don't get a deeper picture what's the cause of a particular event and what effect does this have.
So on the point of nuclear weapons, there are American assessments of why the North Koreans want nuclear weapons. Could you get into that?
Yes, I talk about some of them in the book. I think that since really North Korea claims to have detonated the bomb, I think in 2006 was the first time, but it tends to detonate underground, so it's difficult to tell whether they're bluffing, but the general consensus is that they probably do have nuclear weapons. And even before they had nuclear weapons, CIA reports from the 60s, which are now declassified, were talking about other broader contexts, such as the Vietnam War. And they explained that because the United States had invaded and then escalated the war in Vietnam, North Korea felt compelled to increase its own military. So it was preparing not only for possible war with the US, but it started to attack positions in South Korea as a warning for the US not to expand the war. And this continues. There's Robert Collins, I think his name is. He actually served in the Korean War and went on to become an analyst. And he goes through every 10 years or so, the US initiates a new phase of its military relations with South Korea, which usually involves increasing military capacities and training. So the force of the size of the training units increase, and the types of strategy, such as planning for nuclear attacks against North Korea, also increase. And North Korea is perfectly aware of this, and so they respond. And they respond by building up their own military, by having tit-for-tat provocations with the South, and eventually now it's got to the point where North Korea has supposedly developed not only nuclear weapons, but also the means to deliver them. And the annual threat assessments to Congress, for example, state that one of North Korea's goals is to unify with the South, and it also, North Korea considers itself to be responding to external factors like the ones I'm mentioning.
So that James Clapper, who I think was a director for national intelligence, said that North Korea was focused on deterrence and defense, and that assessment was actually repeated word for word by the current holder of that office, Daniel Coates. And there's a lot about there's a factor of the actual weakness of the North Korean military, which is generally admitted by American generals and the American establishment.
That's right, and the media have a tricky propaganda task here, because on the one hand they want to portray North Korea as a threat to the United States and US interests, but on the other hand they don't want to portray America as being too weak. So they have to, it's a very dubious propaganda strategy that the media is directing, consciously or not, against the American public, to somehow make people feel afraid that we have to deal with this threat, but on the other hand not make them so afraid that they think that their government's too weak. And the fact that exactly the same text is basically cut and pasted from one threat assessment to another shows you that really the politicians are just sort of front people for a much longer policy that's gone on now for decades, which is to I should also point out it's not entirely clear what the US policy towards North Korea is. I think on one hand they would very much like, and by they I mean the top strategists in the White House or in the State Department and the Pentagon. They would like the regime to collapse, but on the other hand, they want to keep the regime going, because if the regime collapses, there could be another one replaces it that is even more interested in China and Russia and follows less U.S. interests. And also the pretext for positioning troops there disappears if the region could become unified or peaceful. How does the US then keep justifying its presence? And I think the real reason for that is to, as I mentioned, is to target China.
So you place the North Korean context, the North Korean crisis, or the North Korean, the U.S. presence in Korea, in South Korea, in the context of the United States East Asia policy, and especially its turning towards East Asia as a foreign policy, as a place for foreign policy concern under Obama.
That's correct, yes. It's a long strategy. So since World War II, the United States has been interested in world domination, and it calls this full spectrum dominance. This is the Space Command and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They even have a name for it. And after World War II, the Japanese were kicked out of Korea, which was then a single entity, and for various reasons the country was partitioned. So you have North and South, and the regime, the Kim regime in the North, did not really integrate into China or Russia. It wanted to maintain a kind of independent course, which Stalin didn't like very much, because of this clashed with Stalin's cult of personality, and Chairman Mao didn't like it very much because it seemed to clash with Maoism. So China and Russia have always considered North Korea to be a problem. So I'm not suggesting that all the problems would resolve if the US withdrew. But certainly America has got no moral or strategic right to maintain its presence in the region, but it has since World War II, and now that many parts of the Middle East are under US control, particularly with its stationing or its construction of permanent military bases in Iraq and in Saudi Arabia, where most of the oil is in the Middle East. Now the US wants to expand into Asia and the Asia Pacific, and this is not the policy or strategy of one particular administration. It's generally part of the US empire. So the full spectrum dominance that I mentioned was announced under Clinton. This was 1997, and then in 2000, the same people that became the Bush administration, calling themselves the Project for the New American Century, these were supposedly the very right-wing neoconservatives, they, in their Rebuilding America's Defenses document, suggested that the next arena for US conflict would be in Asia. And they talked about how to encroach on China and so forth. And then you had, after Bush, you had the Obama presidency with the so-called pivot to Asia. And the reasons are not a secret. You can read about them in Foreign Affairs, which is one of the main US establishment foreign policy journals. Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State at the time, she explained that the US wants to create trade and investment systems, infrastructure, laws in that area of the world, and it doesn't want any challenge to that. So China's economy is fairly complicated. It's despite a lot of misperceptions about China and its economic growth, it has adopted some neoliberal policies which are conducive to US interests, particularly with its labor force being at the low end of the value chain in making products for US and European consumers. iPhones is the most famous one. So the US essentially wants to keep this system in place where China directly or indirectly will be absorbed into the kind of US so-called free trade system and contained within its own boundaries. So that there's some dispute over islands, the Spratly Islands, south of China. And China is also building, I think, one military base in Djibouti in Africa, compared to the US, which has about 600 military bases in the world. But somehow we're supposed to think that China is the next threat to us all, and it must be contained because it's spreading.
Yeah, I was amused that I looked up the Djibouti the Djibouti base, and I was amused to see that Djibouti also contains a Japanese and an American base as well. So I mean, what's that about?
Yeah,
it's not very threatening. So full spectrum dominance, as you were saying, is the military component of the imperial piece, as it were, for protecting U.S. national interests and investment, is the quote.
Yes, and what's particularly interesting about that is that the U.S. economy is really largely now a high-tech economy. So if you look at the biggest U.S. companies, they tend to be internet-based, like Google and Amazon, or else they have high-tech components. Apple is now, I think, the biggest, and a lot of the technology, including the internet and including things like touchscreen technology, this really comes from the Pentagon. This was developed for the military, by the military, for their own use over many decades with public expenditure. And once the products become marketable, they're then sold to US consumers, and the companies have big tax breaks and so on. So the full spectrum dominance, it's part of an overall war economy, but it's fairly subtle because you have to follow the strand of which particular piece of technology comes from which particular sector of the military. So not only is full spectrum dominance the military arm, but it's actually very hard to distinguish where trade and the military begin and end. They have dual use technologies, so the satellites that we're now enjoying to have this conversation, that's all coming out of the military sector, and their aim is to protect this system for the benefit of US corporations. The documents are quite explicit about that, and to simply overwhelm with military force any potential challenge or deterrent to this. So when you have countries like North Korea, which do have nuclear weapons or have mass artillery aimed at US interests, the question then is, how do US planners get around that problem and still maintain their credibility, as they call it, which just means bullying the world into doing what they want. And the US is not unique in this. I mean, when Britain was the global empire, Britain was doing the same sort of thing, but with the technology that it had at the time. And I'm sure if Russia or China were the dominant global powers, you'd have similar sort of effect. But in our time, it happens to be the United States. So and also, I should just add that with nuclear weapons, the stakes are much higher now.
Certainly, but with actually, and that on that point, one of the main points of contention at the moment is the THAAD missiles, which are terminal high altitude air defense, or theater high altitude air defense. It's unclear, actually. I'm not quite clear which one it is. And these have been placed in South Korea. They are, the United States says, designed to counteract a North Korean weapon, but they do have an effect on the calculations of Russia and China as well.
For sure, yes, and this was actually quite explicitly spelled out in the document Rebuilding America's Defenses from the year 2000. They also discuss THAAD missiles. And getting back to this whole notion of tax subsidies for a high-tech economy. This all comes out of taxpayer money, so it's a huge boon for the private companies that are creating these missile systems. And it also has the dual effect of bolstering US imperialism. And these types of missiles are naturally regarded as a serious threat to China and to Russia because they have such a long range, and they have multi uses, not just designed to deter the North Koreans. And there are, of course, there are easy ways to deter a threat, and that is to de-escalate and to live up to your obligations under peace agreements, which the U.S. does not do, because the U.S. isn't the policy planners in Washington are more interested in dominating the globe and having a global so-called free trade economy than they are in de-escalation.
Yeah, I think to make it clear, well, it's not just that the THAAD missiles are defensive. What their intent is to bolster the offensive capability, as it were. Yeah,
and it's a similar thing is happening in Eastern Europe. There's a whole missile system with batteries of Patriot missiles, which are supposedly to deter Iran from firing Scud missiles at Europe. But the whole system is pointed at Russia. And it has a radar system in Turkey and a radar system in the UK, and missiles positioned in Poland, and I think more missiles positioned in Romania. I think Obama was going to position them initially in Czech Republic, if I remember, but it's now put into Romania. But anyway, the point is Russia responded to this by moving its mobile nuclear weapons up to the border with Kaliningrad, the Polish border in Kaliningrad. And this escalated the situation. Hardly anything was reported about it. I found out about it on RT, Russia's propaganda channel, and had to, look for some more objective sources. And almost nothing was reported about it. Very serious development. And the similar sort of thing is happening now with these missile systems being based in Japan and South Korea. China absolutely considers this a threat. And furthermore, the Pentagon realizes this because they even mention it, or at least the US Congress, they even mention it in some of their reports, that this could provoke more responses from China.
And I take your point about if the boot was on the Chinese foot, as it were, things would be in many ways the same. But from China's perspective at the moment, the general assessments of what China seeks at the moment, they are something pretty different from a kind of seeking to be an overbearing military power.
At the moment, for sure, there's no indication that China has the means or the will to create a kind of US-style empire. China has certainly oil interests in Africa, for example, and the US has been trying to isolate China and even go as far as trying to kick out some Chinese contractors who were working in Libya and Zimbabwe. And this, from the perspective of the US planners, who really believe they own the world and think the world should be run in US interests because that's the best for everybody. And the British Empire was exactly the same. They had the same mentality. For them, China doing anything in any other country except itself is a real threat to the United States, and it's a threat to world peace and so on. This kind of mentality is fostered when in conditions of power. So the U.S. has so much power that it considers that it owns the world. So any kind of Chinese interference in its own interests, that's intolerable, even though that might be in Libya or Zimbabwe, things that objectively have nothing to do with the United States. And even within China itself, the US has tried and to a degree succeeded to transform the economy into a so-called free market neoliberal economy to reflect its own interests.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating part of the book where you go through it maybe not being a primary consideration, but it being certainly a consideration that China was priced out of Iraqi oil and is always being competed with in third countries, as it were. So the China's, as it were, policy to North Korea does have kind of internal contradictions, or it has different kind of stresses, maybe potentially contradictory goals. For example, it doesn't particularly want North Korea to have nuclear weapons. One of the things we're hearing is from American politicians is China has to do it all. China has to denuclearize North Korea, apply pressure, apply sanctions. Could you take us through what China's policy? What kind of the elements of a Chinese policy towards North Korea?
Well, China, as far as I can tell, and again, this is only from English language things that I can read from strategic analysts. But as far as I can tell, China has it sees North Korea as a kind of liability, because on the one hand it has a border with China, so there are refugees who are fleeing the economic crisis and the famines in North Korea. So there could be a cultural problem there with China having to absorb some refugees. Much more serious than that for China is the fact that North Korea has, or at least claims and probably does have, nuclear weapons. So therefore North Korea is pursuing an independent course. So it can't really credibly be called a proxy of China. But on the other hand, North Korea is very desperate for investment, and so China has taken the advantage there. And most of the infrastructure investment in North Korea, particularly in more recent years, has come from China. So China's trying to encourage North Korea through the six-party talks and others through bilateral negotiations to denuclearize. And also China has to consider the United States actions. The more aggressive and provoking the United States becomes, the less incentive China has to make North Korea denuclearize or to try and de-escalate the tensions with North Korea. So the US also, as I mentioned earlier, seems to have an ambiguous policy and ambiguous objectives towards North Korea. And because nothing is really clear, and because the North Korean regime does seem to have a defensive capability, which the Western media spin as offensive, this means that there's a long-standing question mark over how to handle the situation from the point of view of the US war planners and the point of view of the Chinese. But as far as living up to its peace treaty obligations is concerned, the United States does have an obligation to provide North Korea with the aid and fuel that it's constantly promised. And we do, if you look through the history, there's a chapter in the book about, or a subchapter in the book about it. It runs through the history really since the late 80s up to the present, where every time the United States has pretended to attempt to negotiate with North Korea, it has either not lived up to its obligations or it's taken a very aggressive stance, and North Korea has responded by escalating tensions. So the lesson is...
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so the lesson is, if we really want peace in the region, then we should at least try to live up to obligations.
Yeah. For example, the states reneged on an agreement to provide heavy fuel oil after a 1994 agreement to under which North Korea, I guess, agreed to not to continue a weapons program, but to have nuclear plants, for nuclear power plants, and so on.
That's correct, yes. And then by the time the Bush administration, this was under Clinton, and by the time the Bush administration had come into power in 2001, and particularly after 9/11, when they had, a blank check to behave as aggressively as they wanted and justify anything as part of, defending ourselves against terrorists, whether it's state terrorists or Islamic terrorists, the Bush administration's approach was just arrogant, and in fact, I think it's the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, which is one of the main research institutions in the US. I think it was a group of scholars there pointed out that by labeling North Korea as part of this axis of evil, it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that North Korea feels backed into a corner, and so it's going to push ahead with its nuclear program.
Yeah. So and there's the kind of dance of alleged negotiations, then withdrawals, talks is on the surface it seems pretty mind-boggling, but the pattern does seem to be that when there is a serious proposal, the United States kind of says no, forget it, we're not engaging.
Yeah, or it makes the conditions impossible, such as the one I mentioned earlier, where Tillerson says we have a precondition of denuclearization. So while the US, they haven't admitted it, but probably stations nuclear weapons itself in the region, and certainly has all this missile infrastructure that you were talking about earlier with the THAADs and so on, huge number of troops stationed both in Japan and South Korea, continues to conduct very provocative military exercises, and that's separate from its constant threats against Russia. North Korea is supposed to sit in the middle of this and get rid of its nuclear weapons. That's the precondition for US talks. So that's just giving North Korea a license to continue possession of its weapons. But I think the bigger question we should be asking is, why should the United States or Britain or anybody have a license to dominate the region or even the world?
Yeah, I think that can be kind of taken for granted. It's as though these kinds of military exercises are just a kind of are an exercise, like going for a run or whatever. In 2016, there were huge, the kind of largest and longest lasting military exercises the United States has been involved in Korea, and 300,000 South Korean troops and 17,000 US troops, and even recently there's been the biggest build up of stealth aircraft in the Korean Peninsula ever. So what are you going to do with that?
Yeah. And as we were saying earlier, the Kim regime, the successive leaders, they understand perfectly well that if you want to deter an attack from the United States, you have to arm yourself.
Yeah. So I think and meanwhile there are pretty there are sanctions going on which are pretty serious. They're having some effect on the North Korean economy, and one of the things that was pointed out in your book, and also was even pointed out you won't hear it everywhere, but it was pointed out in the New York Times article published yesterday, the 8th of January, that North Korea is very much focused on not having a military first policy quite as much. It's relying on nuclear weapons for defense, but it's also very much focused on improving the economy, which is not much desired by the United States.
No, it's a strange mix in North Korea because it's obviously a military economy with huge state controls, but over the last, say, 10 years or so, it's gradually been making what are called reforms, which means turning it into a market economy. So the US now has another dimension to its North Korea strategy, which is to try and pursue limited so-called free markets, which means privatization and possibly leading to exports of resources. But on the other hand, it needs to, or it feels it wants to maintain these appalling sanctions on North Korea. And again, the reasons for the sanctions are not entirely clear. On the one hand, they're designed to try and put so much pressure on the regime that it collapses. But on the other hand, there's not really much evidence that the US wants the regime to collapse. So it seems to be just a continuation of this policy of containment, or what they call containment. And the sanctions, according to the Food and Agricultural Administration or Organization of the United Nations, that's really having an appalling effect on ordinary North Koreans in terms of malnutrition. It's crippling a lot of the food system, including for aid agencies. North Korea has allowed some aid agencies into the country, and they have been reporting now that they're finding it hard to operate because of even targeted sanctions against North Korean banks. They're not able to move their money and so on into the country. So even the agencies are finding it difficult to keep the population alive. And this can be very easily spun by the media as, look at the evil North Korean regime starving its own people, when in fact the Western countries share a huge part of the responsibility for this food crisis that now seems to have been enveloping the country.
Yeah, and I guess one reason for the sanctions would be to have some effect on Chinese investment in North Korea as well. So, I think one of the points you've raised is about the way, part of the way to peace being not escalation but de-escalation. Talk about that.
Yeah, the indications are that every time the United States offers a serious negotiation to North Korea, and again, we should be asking, what business is it of the United States anyway to be doing anything with North Korea or South Korea? So that's another question. But
one of the Congressional Research Service, I think it is, has actually said it's there as an option on the table. Like, it's not like they're committed to it, that the United States could drop this matter, but it's not consistent with control.
That's right, yes. And interestingly, the same sort of reports say that it seems to be that people in Congress have a kind of fixation on North Korea, that they're not doing what they're told. And even Trump, when he was a candidate for, was it the Reform Party back in the year 2000, he wrote a book called The America We Deserve, in which even Donald Trump was talking about this problem we have with North Korea and how we, possibly need to go and smash them up to try and sort it out. So, putting aside the question of what right does the United States have to do anything in North Korea, just looking at the facts, history would seem to suggest that every time the United States makes an offer, North Korea accepts it and they move towards negotiation. And these sort of, this is practically admitted in the kind of documents that I'm talking about. U.S. congressional services, they provide histories of negotiations, and every time North Korea acquiesces, the U.S. Changes its mind and alters the parameters of the agreements. So one path to peace there is to raise enough awareness within the United States among activists to put pressure on the government to stop rejecting North Korea's moves towards peace. And another thing is, in the middle of all this, there are significant protests in South Korea and in Japan from peace activists who want the United States military bases out of their country. So those people could be helped. Networks and associations could be set up, for example, by trade unions, some of which have a good record on international peace relations. So in the UK, for example, or in the US, associations could be made. So it's a question of raising awareness and finding the will to do it, because obviously we're not only up against the huge US military machine, which is committed to world domination, we're also up against authoritarian China and newly revived Russia. So it's certainly not easy, but the only other option is to let this long-standing policy that the US has continue to the point where there's going to be probably a serious accident, if not a war.
That's one of the points you make in the book, and a war could come just through strategic miscalculation, through a misjudgment of what the other guys are intending to do.
Yeah, and that's basically quoting the British Ministry of Defence and others who, they're in a position to know. They plan wars and they plan for war and they have nuclear weapons, and they are saying this is what could happen. So, I mean, with all the so-called threats that British people face from whatever it might be, terrorism or extreme left-wing politics, as the media ridiculously claim, this threat could wipe us all out quite by accident, and nobody's talking about it.
Tim Coles publishes as TJ Coles, and that's the name to use to find him on any internet bookshop. We didn't even cover the most popular news story of the year as regards North Korea, which was Trump's response to Kim Jong-un's comment that he had a nuclear button on his table at all times. Trump's response that he had a bigger, more powerful button and one that worked. To save us from cliche, it's worth noting that on Sunday, the 7th of January, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Mike Pompeo, said that Trump's response was consonant, was in line with US policy as regards North Korea. And we should, I think, take him at his word with that. Maybe The Bigger Button would not be a bad title for a book about US policy in North Korea. To get back to the element of why this, why now, it is worth looking, or bearing in mind, with appropriate reservations about maybe some propagandistic elements in it. The story also published on Sunday, the 7th of January, by William Broad and David Sanger, How US Intelligence Agencies Underestimated North Korea, which basically says that the timeline, their expectations of when North Korea would have ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and nuclear weapons of appropriate strength and power, sped up by 2 years over the past 2 years. And maybe this is why there are headaches in Washington at the moment, and why this is being dealt with force, with rhetorical force at least. And dubious or informative as that story may be, there was a story of incredible dubiousness in the Asahi Shimbun on December the 20th. Not much noticed, but worth reporting because it seems very propagandistic, which was North Korea said to be testing anthrax-tipped ballistic missiles. The quote is, Pyongyang is conducting heat and pressure resistance tests to see whether anthrax germs can survive at temperatures of 7,000 degrees or higher, the level an ICBM encounters when it re-enters Earth's atmosphere. And also that there was an unconfirmed intelligence report that North Korea has already succeeded in such experiments. Now, any ICBM will explode when it reaches its destination, and it's also worth noting that according to the Journal of Medical Toxicology, anthrax spores won't survive at 400 degrees Fahrenheit or 204 degrees centigrade for more than 5 minutes. So 7,000 degrees in either scale seems like a bit of a push. That story came 2 days after Trump's national security strategy mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, which also harped on the biological weapons threat that North Korea is said to pose. I referred to a Daily Telegraph story also published on the 20th of December about a planned bloody nose attack, whose plans were currently being drawn up. And that's pretty worrying. All of those stories will be in podcast notes on my website, roryo'connorjournalist.com. Finally, I'd like to thank my patrons on my Patreon campaign. Very much appreciated. Their names are Jean Calnan, Ian O'Connor, very much related, Emma Blake Corrigan, and Owen Barfield Jr. Thank you all very much, and thank you to all my listeners. Bye bye.